Okay, well, hello to everyone, and as you can see from my front slide there, I'm going to talk under this heading of circadian justice. So my background is in politics and sociology, and so I come to this topic of sleep with the interest of someone interested in democracy in particular, and this heading of circadian justice is my route into a topic which I would imagine for many of you is approached through the natural sciences, but it's a topic that I came through by the study of, as I say, politics and sociology, and I wanted to think about how one might take a political approach to thinking about matters of sleep. And the basic thought that informs the discussion is that when problems of sleep arise, they're often unequally distributed. In other words, although one can talk about some macro tendencies in societies at large to do with how people sleep and the extent to which they sleep well or badly and so on, and I'll come to some of those points in a moment, and some of them will be quite familiar. At the same time, of course, crucial is always how such matters are unevenly distributed. And the thought behind this notion of circadian justice is that one might be able to highlight a set of concerns which are rooted in sleep, are problems of sleep, not just expressed through the effects of bad sleep, and are in questions of justice insofar as they not only have unequal distribution, but they affect some at the expense of others, that there are kind of structural questions to do with how people sleep and how well people sleep, which are ones that involve some, if you like, benefiting at the expense of others, or societies designed with certain norms and certain experiences in mind rather than others. And so to the extent then that one has problems which are kind of unequally distributed, and hardships which are experienced by some especially, but also are, if you like, others are the beneficiaries of those unequally distributed problems. To that extent, one might be able to talk about questions of justice to do with sleep. Circadian justice, then, as the heading that I wanted to speak under. So much to say then that I come at this as a question of the politics of sleep. And maybe the other thing that I would underline as we move into this topic would be to do with this idea of sleep as a corrosive disadvantage. Clearly, there's a sense in which problems to do with short sleep or poor quality sleep, or all the kind of health issues that may arise through different ways in which sleep is undertaken, to some extent, as I think will be quite familiar, they are problems that reflect other problems. People who are disadvantaged in class terms, for example, or any number of minority disadvantages, are likely to perhaps be first in line for the whole range of health problems, including problems to do with sleep. But that would then be to simply treat issues of sleep as kind of reflective of other problems. But the kind of guiding impulse of what I want to talk about under this heading of circadian justice, one shouldn't just think about questions of sleep in this sense as being reflective of something more foundational, just kind of epiphenomenal, if you like, but rather that there is something distinctive about issues of sleep which can be thought, as I have here, as a corrosive disadvantage. In other words, things that make that produce other disadvantages, which have a kind of causal aspect and not simply at the end, if you like, of a causal chain. And there I would suggest, for example, that poor sleep can make bad circumstances less bearable. In other words, and we'll come back in a moment to some of the political implications of this, but that one might say that question of poor sleep, it's not simply that they reflect circumstances, but they can make circumstances more unbearable than they would be perhaps otherwise. To that extent, there is something specific about sleep, which, as I say, has its own kind of significance, and is not simply a reflection of other factors. And also that one might say that there is something about sleep which can influence an individual or a group's ability to change their circumstances. So it's partly experiential. How you experience those circumstances can be modified through the poor quality of sleep that may come with them, but also the capacity to change those circumstances, the willingness or the belief, the conviction that one can find ways to change circumstances may also be something that is shaped to do with different forms of poor sleep. And so to that extent, again, one might say this is not simply circadian justice, if we can name such a field, as not simply another way of talking about familiar forms of inequality, injustice, and so on, but it is something that one might want to identify as having its own distinct self-standing quality. In other words, as I say there, why bad sleep is more than just a symptom of other problems. So that is, if you like, the motivation for what I want to talk about, that there's something here which in this topic of sleep, which is worthy of inquiry because it has a sort of self-standing significance. Okay, so I come at this topic in awareness, I guess, of a number of contemporary tendencies in societies at large, which, if you like, puts this question of circadian justice on the agenda. I wouldn't say it's a highly politicized topic, and that's something I want to come into in a moment, exactly the difficulty of politicizing problems to do with sleep and the inequalities that flow from them. But nonetheless, I think there are certain respects in which these are salient issues, even if they're not always named as such, or named in the way that I'm describing. And for three main reasons I've put down on the slide here. In other words, three contemporary tendencies that we might say are contributing to questions of circadian justice arising. So these are kind of much discussed in the sociology of sleep, and indeed contested. In other words, whether one can really talk about wider societal patterns of the shortening of sleep is clearly something about which there is a great deal of empirical research and also a great deal of debate. I think insofar as one can make an argument that short sleep is increasingly a problem in contemporary societies, it's probably not necessarily in the form of an argument that says the average number of hours of sleep is declining. There may be countries in which that is true. There certainly may be classes in which that is true. But I guess the way one can phrase it least contestably is to say that those at the extreme who are experiencing extremes of short sleep are perhaps on the rise. In other words, that one that doesn't necessarily find this it's expressed in terms of averages, but in terms of extremes of experience. So whether one attributes that to technological changes, to changes in the bedroom, whether one attributes it to changes in the economy, to do with some advances in capitalism, platform capitalism, and so on, things I'll say a bit more about in a moment, many routes into that particular notion, but that there should be something like a shortening of sleep at the extremes, in other words, expanding models afflicted by short sleep, I think would be one point of departure for the topic that I want to elaborate. The second would be to do with the irregularization of sleep. In other words, to say, if you like, regardless of the number of hours people sleep on a daily or a weekly basis, that there is a kind of irregularization of the time allocation of sleep. And here, I would draw on plenty of sociology that talks about, again, those that live under employment regimes that schedule their day-to-day lives in ways that are not consistent across time, maybe involve getting up early and staying up late and then having a rest day, or indeed not a rest day, but schedules which are not necessarily the same schedule day to day and week to week, but are variable. It could also be irregularization of sleep in the sense of the location of sleep. So think of someone that has to work shifts and has to sleep on a job at certain times, or think of someone who, I don't know, works taxis and ends up to maximize their capacity to do their job, sleeping in on site, if you like, at certain times of the week. So this would, of course, be a separate tendency from the shortening of sleep, the regularization of sleep. And the one I mentioned here is to do the desynchronization of sleep, perhaps slightly less obvious than the other two, but the notion, I guess, would be that many, certainly Western societies, I think over the last 150 years or so, have developed a kind of a normative order of sleep, a set of expectations about when people can expect to sleep. Of course, they may not always exercise that that opportunity. There's plenty of personal discretion there, but there might be periods of the day when most people are sleeping, a kind of synchronization of the working day. It's often first the driver of this, and then by derivation, a synchronization of the leisure parts of the day, the rest parts of the day. And the suggestion would be that one tendency that one can identify in societies today, again, specific to certain groups within them, would be the desynchronization of sleep. In other words, people sleeping at different times. Think of shift work, think of, well, various aspects of globalization that may involve the synchronization of those in different time zones. So people working call centers that are targeting markets in other parts of the world, which require people to be awake to man those phone lines and so on. One example of how you might see the desynchronization of those who live physically proximate, which of course is a kind of synchronization of those who may live quite far from each other. So this would be another, I would suggest, general tendency that one might treat as a point of departure for thinking about sleep and social political implications in contemporary societies, that there are, at least around the margins of populations, tendencies towards the shortening, the irregularization, and the desynchronization of sleep. The way I've tended to explore this idea is in terms of the economy, in terms of changes within digital and platform-centered capitalism, but of course one could also think of this in terms of climate change, for example. I mean, it seems to me that one reason why one might expect these inequalities to continue is that some of the effects that one can plausibly associate with climate change may contribute to them. So if climate change produces efforts to live in hotter climates, efforts to adapt to hotter climates, efforts to escape hotter climates, all of those things can feed into the kind of tendencies I'm describing. So, efforts to survive in hotter climates clearly can be consistent with the shortening of sleep, insofar as the things that make sleep possible in hot climates may be unevenly distributed, whether it's air conditioning, whether it's the capacity to insulate yourself from the noise that may arise once you try to adapt to hotter climates by opening windows and so on. These kind of things clearly have a kind of amplified effect once temperature differentials start to become themselves magnified, and that effect, again, like everything I've said so far, is likely to be of unequal distribution. It's going to be worse for some people than others. Those that afford air conditioning and so on are not likely to necessarily experience that, at least in the immediate term. In terms of structural adaptations to hotter climates, this is something where one might talk about people spreading labor through different parts of the day into the night as a way of taking advantage of different energy prices. So think, for example, as far as energy becomes increasingly metered in a world of climate change, that there may be good reasons to want to use electricity at points of lower general demand than others, and this may incentivize, again, what I talked about under the heading of the desynchronization of sleep. And then, of course, there's everything that one might want to add to do with migration, efforts to escape climate change, or to make a life livable under conditions of climate change. Again, I would suggest that these are all tendencies that, even if they are still incipient today, are likely to contribute in some way to these three tendencies that I've screened here, as well as a number that I haven't highlighted. So all of this then to say that there is a kind of clear sociological point of departure for thinking about how structures of sleep in contemporary society may be changing at present. Okay, so what might be taken from this? The basic structure of what I want to say for the next 15 minutes is roughly as follows: that one might think in terms of two general kinds of inequality that can flow from this. One might call social inequality, which would be various forms of disadvantage that flow directly from poor sleep, compromised sleep of one kind or another, also desynchronized sleep, in other words, sleep which may not be bad on its own terms, but nonetheless has kind of points of friction with the experiences of others in society. So it's forms of social inequality on the one hand, forms of political inequality then on the other hand. And I'll come to those in a moment, potentially perhaps the more unfamiliar aspect of this. So I shall perhaps dwell a little bit more on that in a moment. But first of all, let me start with the first category, sleep and social inequality. Well, the thought here would be that the kind of tendencies that I've just been describing are likely to have unequal effects in society and create forms of inequality, both material, so in the sense of could be physical conditions, obesity, health issues, all kind of things that scholars of circadian rhythms will be extremely familiar with, but the ways in which interference with patterns of sleep can produce, if you like, physical material disadvantages for those individuals that are afflicted. And of course, what one might call social disadvantages to do with, the kind of the indignities of being, visibly tired, for example, tired on the job, in a situation where a certain form of embarrassment can arise because certain types of the effects of poor sleep are in some way difficult to disguise. And as I said before, when talking about corrosive disadvantages, I mean, many of these forms of social inequality will play off existing inequalities. They kind of amplify what's already there. But of course, they can also be the basis of new inequalities. I mean, when people are, experiencing the need to sleep in their car as part of a job which requires maximizing the revenue you get at times when the market is most able to reward you. So think of an Uber driver, for example. There's plenty of newspaper reports of Uber drivers sleeping in car parks at weekends as a way of maximizing revenue. This type of form of, if you like, social disadvantage that comes both with the indignities of sleeping in a car, the material aspects to do with displacement and dislocation from family, and of course the physical issues and mental issues of well-being that can come from that. We might say that all these are, if you like, aspects of inequality which are specific to sleep, bound up in sleep, not just simply reflective of other types of social disadvantage. Now, of course, I said at the beginning, I'm coming at this as someone with an interest in politics, and many political philosophers, I guess, would immediately ask, well, is this a question actually of justice? Why flag up to such a term as circadian justice when these might not be issues of justice at all? Not every form of inequality is necessarily an issue of injustice. There may be inequalities which are, for example, voluntarily embraced by those who then experience them. And you might say, well, if an inequality is chosen, to what extent is it unjust? If someone chooses to work irregular hours as a way of maximizing their income, and if they're working in a profession or in a series of temporary jobs which invite that kind of behavior, but they have chosen to undertake those jobs, in what respect is one even talking about questions of justice here? One is simply highlighting that there are inequalities, but not necessarily that they are unjust inequalities. Well, I think, to cut a long story short here, because whenever one engages with that question in political philosophy, there's going to be always plenty to try and tease out there. But the general thought, and it would be played out in so many forms of social inequality, the general thought that would be that even things which are ostensibly chosen may be chosen under imperfect conditions, where the alternatives are not particularly compelling, where perhaps individuals don't know what they're getting into. In other words, there are questions of the kind of the freeness with which the choice is undertaken, the knowledge with which it is undertaken. And of course, in the case of sleep, there are plenty of knock-on effects, in other words, effects for other people. So looking at it simply in terms of individual choice is going to miss quite a lot. There are many implications for those around individuals that I think put this firmly in the category of questions of justice, rather than simply voluntary inequality. There's much one can say on such a topic, but I think this is roughly why I would say this is a question of circadian justice, not simply a question of observing sleep-related inequalities. And of course, to add to that, one might say that there's a general principle in a lot of normative political theory that people should avoid benefiting from the suffering of others. In other words, that if there is socially useful work done by those who are undergoing hardships to do with sleep, then that is in itself something that requires a kind of obligation to try and not let those inequalities persist, to make them matters of justice, to try and reduce the harmful effects for those that experience them. So questions of fairness, reciprocity would then be tied into this. Okay, well, I said that only part of what I wanted to talk about was to do with social inequality. In other words, ways in which people are made, I would say, unjustly unequal to one another, partly because sleep amplifies existing problems, and partly, as I say, because I think it acts as a kind of distinctive vector of certain problems. But another kind of inequality, I guess, would be to do with politics. In other words, not just the experience in a day-to-day way of certain hardships, but the political capacity to shape the political system within which you live, to try and alleviate whatever social hardships you are experiencing. So whether it's the capacity to vote, or whether it's the capacity to join protests, to try and mobilize around certain issues, you might say, well, these are all things that are a little bit different from social inequalities. They're kind of the capacity to change the conditions within which social inequalities play out. And here I think put down again a few points which to me seem important insofar as they are ways in which those three tendencies I began with, to do with shortened sleep, irregular sleep, desynchronized sleep, can have implications for people's capacity to participate in politics, to shape it deliberatively, and to express solidarity with each other. So in terms of participation, for example, and this is, I think, the most intuitive, clearly participation can be reduced at one level simply to voting in elections. Many thinkers of democracy would say that that is quite a curtailed understanding of what politics is, because what happens in elections is, of course, shaped by everything that happens between elections, and what political parties stand for in elections tends to be a function, at least in part, of the capacity of people to mobilize, to protest, to bring issues to attention, to politicize issues in the long gaps between elections. So political participation is not just about voting. You might say, well, Is anyone ever so disadvantaged by questions of sleep that they can't go out and vote? In the limit case, surely yes, but I think that would be small minorities we're talking about there. There are many other reasons why people don't vote rather than to do with their experiences of sleep. But of course, if one then brings the spotlight to some of those things between elections, like protests, like membership of organizations, political parties, trade unions, for example, these are all things where the implications of sleep may be far more significant. So, for example, it's sometimes said by political philosophers that to be able to participate in political actions of this kind requires a kind of freedom, which is the freedom of time. In other words, the capacity to meet up with others at the same time, to have shared free time, shared leisure time when you're not busy doing something else. But of course, it also means to have that in a predictable fashion so that you can coordinate. And I mean, here I think one starts to see much more clearly how questions of sleep can have political implications. So yes, on the one hand, it may be about voting, and I think there are empirical studies that say that there are lower levels of voting do correlate with sleep deprivation, but perhaps more interestingly are the ways in which other forms of participation are compromised when either people are too tired to want to go to protests, when they are kind of subsisting, catering to basic needs rather than having that basic amount of physical and material security to devote their minds to such activities. When think again of the desynchronization of sleep, if you're on shift work, if you are part of the world of the night rather than the day, you can easily feel alienated, but also simply obstructions to the capacity to coordinate with others in a political context. Political parties, trade unions, these are all daytime institutions. The basic institutions of politics, I think, still have a circadian aspect to them in a way that can therefore create barriers to those who are living by other rhythms. And to the extent that desynchronization plays out, more and more people live by other rhythms and are then to that degree excluded from participation in institutions that are still kind of working with the old norms. I put down questions of deliberation here. When I was writing a paper on this topic, I was interested to read arguments about authoritarian politics sometimes emphasize sleep as relevant to authoritarian, for support for authoritarian forms of politics, whether it's the kind of the timing of votes, of decisions at moments which people can be unable to express much deliberative capacity. Erich Fromm has a analysis of the Third Reich, which is very much highlighting exactly the utilization of sleep deprivation as a way of buying consent for policies for regimes that otherwise might have more reasonable inclination to contest. But I guess you don't have to go to the extremes of authoritarian politics. You might also think about more technocratic forms of politics. In other words, politics which doesn't really require much engagement from ordinary people, which is a kind of elitist politics. You might say, well, this is again something that's likely to prosper under conditions of people struggling to participate, of people lacking the restedness, the frame of mind that might encourage them to get more involved. So deliberation, so in other words, not just the capacity to be in politics, but to be in a certain kind of politics, which is one that you can try and shape through engagement in debate, in contestation, and so on. That's also potentially likely to suffer. And the third key word I put down is solidarity, of the ways in which even something as mundane as sleep habits can be something which potentially interferes with solidarity, whether it's by separating people from the schedules around which coordination with others is possible. So again, there's kind of anthropological work on shift work that suggests that those who are kind of temporally marginalized are likely to feel marginalized in terms of social solidarity and the capacity to politically act then with those that live to other timescales to themselves. Obviously, misalignment of sleep schedules can also be something that induces anxiety, a sense of competition between those who sleep at different times, the fear that as you're trying to sleep, someone else is working, is doing something that maybe comes at your cost. And so, in other words, whether it's these kind of very micro level concerns or whether it's larger questions to do with mistrust, social segregation, you might say that those three patterns that I began with to do with sleep have implications for, as I say, another key word, another key value of democratic politics: solidarity, the capacity to do things collectively, not just as individuals, because of course politics, just an individualized process, is likely to give more power to those who already have it. Okay, so much, in other words, to say that when we're thinking about inequalities, which, as I've said, I consider to be questions of justice and not simply kind of neutral discrepancies, that they can fall on the one hand into categories to do with social inequality. So that might be to do with physical health, to do with questions of dignity of your recognition from other people. On this other hand, then, to do with political inequality, it's not just those day-to-day experiences, it's the capacity to shape the society in which you live by political means, and that your capacity to do exactly that can be inhibited by wider structural changes in how sleep is experienced. Okay, so as I now move to the final phase of what I wanted to talk about, as I'm sure you'll all be hyper aware, when questions of quality of sleep come into public discussion, scarcely a week seems to go by without some type of analysis in the newspapers about whether people are getting enough sleep, how you can make sure that you get enough sleep. There's often this accent on individual experience, cultivating good habits, sleep hygiene, these kind of things. And as, of course, many have argued already, this is obviously quite a limited way of thinking about what ultimately are likely to be structural problems. In other words, if people are experiencing bad sleep because they live in a block of flats where the sound insulation is poor and the people around them, their neighbors, increasingly live to different schedules, daily rhythms to themselves, that's not really something that advice about getting to bed at 10 p.m., having a cup of tea before sleep and so on is likely to have much impact upon. So the individualization, the privatization of questions of sleep health is clearly one familiar response, but I think the one that doesn't quite get to the issues that I wanted to capture under this heading of circadian justice. More promising, of course, then there's arguments to do with well, should sleep be a right? Is it something that can be supported by various legal means, whether it's rights to employment rights to have limits to the working day, rights to have schedules which are known in advance, predictive scheduling, as opposed to kind of algorithmic scheduling that contributes to the irregularization patterns that I was talking about earlier on. There's plenty of jurisdictions in the US and I think also in Europe now, which are exactly going in this direction and perhaps taking seriously the importance of sleep as something deserving legal protection and not simply medical advice. It seems to me, though, and this is where I want to kind of build to the conclusion now, it seems to me that even that type of approach is unlikely to be significant. I mean, it may have something positive to contribute on the first two things I was talking about, shortening of sleep, the irregularization of sleep. But of course, if one takes seriously that there's another thing going on here, which is the desynchronization of sleep, people living to different patterns, daily rhythms, which put them in points of friction with each other. Then it may be that the kind of the arguments for sleep rights and so on are insignificant and inadequate to address those kind of things. I put down a simple distinction here to highlight how one might get a grip on this problem. So if one accepts that some type of desynchronization of sleep schedules is a phenomenon, I would say, incidentally, accelerated during the pandemic and still after the pandemic, if one says there is something going on of that kind, well, in terms of the kind of the models, the ideals that you might want to pursue in the light of that, if you wanted to take seriously those kind of concerns, one model would be to say, well, we need to rebuild the rhythms of modern societies. Of course, they were never perfectly achieved. There's always been shift work. There's always been people living to different schedules from others. But you might say, well, we can still move back in that direction, just as we might try to make the weekend, make moments of common repose. We might be able to make moments of common sleep and rest in the model of kind of the 9-to-5 job and its attendant leisure time. What I think is more promising and indeed more radical, less reactionary, is to think about how one might design societies not around the single rhythm. In other words, not what I think will always be an unrealizable effort to resynchronize daily schedules, but how one might think about designing or fostering societies that live to multiple rhythms. In other words, in a sense, they already do, but how do you design societies where that doesn't become a source of injustice? It doesn't produce hardships in the way that I would suggest that it currently does. In other words, that would be something starts from fairly doable changes to do with making institutions 24-hour institutions. I talked about parties, I talked about trade unions. Clearly, institutions are one of the ways that people have access to politics, entry points into democracy. If they are structured around circadian rhythms that large minorities don't live by, then that's, I would say, quite exclusionary. You can imagine fairly simple adaptations that might make them less so, that would rebuild social structures around a kind of ideal of multiple rhythms rather than the single rhythm. But ultimately, it seems to me that that's quite a radical project, the idea of a polyrhythmic society. If you take seriously that society should have they should not make any particular schedule a source of disadvantage, then that's a project that takes you into many different fields. I talked about noise insulation, light insulation, the ways in which I would suggest that many of our architecture, the design of the urban environments of many contemporary societies, is still indebted to an age in which people could expect the synchronization of sleep. And the more one moves away from that model, then the more one might have to rather profoundly adjust many aspects of the built environment to contend with that. So I would suggest it's a fairly far-reaching political project. May invite you to do things that you want to do for other reasons as well, for reasons of inequality that are unrelated to sleep, but I think would have distinctive aspects which are to do with sleep. The very final point with my last 30 seconds that I would emphasize here is I think one has to be a bit careful, especially as one moves into these questions of public policy, of approaching this as a matter of having kind of sensible ideas that if one shouts loud enough that someone in authority might be inclined to introduce and to just make society a better place. I think the kind of model of democracy that I would have is a much more adversarial one, in which there are those who are in power that don't necessarily listen to the force of the better argument, don't necessarily think that just because it would be nice if everyone was well slept, we should then make public policy to make that a reality. I think, on the contrary, one of the reasons why the inequalities that political inequalities that are tied up in sleep are important is because you cannot assume that governments are benevolent, that they want to necessarily make public policies that simply maximize the well-being of the greatest number. And this, for me, is the kind of the biggest challenge in terms of these issues of circadian justice that I've been talking about. That there are good reasons to want fairly profound societal change in awareness of these problems. And yet there's a kind of problem of agency. Who's going to lead such a process? I don't think one can assume that governments, that existing economic interests all necessarily want rested populations. Some may well do. Some may have economic reasons to want to ensure that some parts of the population are well rested. But there should be a kind of general benevolent disposition, I think, is very much the problem. So you have, I would say, inequalities of sleep that have political implications. And yet the capacity to change politics is itself stymied by the very things that are causing the problems. So in that sense, there's a problem of agency. How do you deal with circadian justice? If there's a sleep cleavage where some sleep better and others sleep worse, some are afflicted by hardships, others are protected from hardships, do you look for change by looking to those who are afflicted, just as you might look for revolutionary economic change by looking at the working class traditionally? Is there something analogous with sleep that you say, well, let's look at those who are tired. Those are going to be the motors of change in all social structural issues to do with sleep? Obviously, not necessarily, because it's exactly those problems of sleep that may make them the least agential, the most unable to change society in these ways. And so to that extent, you might say, well, if there's a politics of circadian justice, doesn't come from those who are the most deprived. It comes rather from those who are relatively well slept. That's where sleep justice has to begin. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for this very, very nice talk. You get a lot of applause from the audience as well.